Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Caleb Bond, filling in for Sharri Markson. Well, let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Here's what's coming up on the program. Parliament clashes over the new emergency measures seeking to curb the risk of the recently released criminal detainees. Jenna Clark, Jason Morrison and Holly Hughes will see if Labor's doing enough to protect Australians from these violent criminals. Andrew Hastie is on the show to analyse Chinese President Xi Jinping's secret warnings against the West, hidden in his messages of cooperation and togetherness, as the communist leader meets with President Joe Biden in San Francisco, and he will have some breaking news about footage he has seen from Israel. And a daughter of a Holocaust survivor joins me to recount her mother's incredible tales of love and compassion in a time of darkness. Well, Immigration Minister Andrew Giles today described today's bill to restrict these previously detained asylum seekers, many of them heinous criminals, as urgent.
And that is why today we have introduced urgent legislation to strengthen visa restrictions and impose criminal penalties on non-citizens where necessary to keep Australians safe.
But the fact is, there was no sense of urgency about this at all. The High Court handed down its decision last Wednesday, more than a week ago. Only today, Thursday, has the Anthony Albanese Labor government shown any kind of effort to restrict these people. Now, just as a reminder, the test case for all this was a man who raped a 10-year-old boy. He was the first person freed, wandering the streets. And perversely, because his victim can't be identified as a child, nor can he. So we only know him as NZYQ. He raped a boy, he helped overturn a precedent that allowed people like him to be detained, and now he is anonymous and walking among us. Those released include Aliyawa Yawari, a violent sex offender who has a record of attacking elderly women and described as a danger to the Australian community by a judge, and Sarul Azhar Umar, a Malaysian hitman who killed a pregnant woman and then blew up her body. Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles said today that the government would mercifully make an effort to talk to the victims of these grubs and their families.
We will make our best efforts to communicate with the families of victims around not only the circumstances of the release, but the steps that the government is now taking in accordance with the legislation as amended that is passed this parliament. We will do our best efforts in relation to that.
Well, I'm sure that'll allay their fears. Mr. or Mrs. Bureaucrat will call them up from the department to tell them that their rapist is out and about again. But it's okay, because we're going to put an ankle bracelet on the turd. Seriously. There are plenty of others: murderers, rapists, child abusers. More than half of the 92 people set for release had their visas cancelled due to serious criminality. These are the charmers who've been allowed back on our streets. 84 of them are out so far. There's another 340 on the cards. So the government found out last Wednesday, at the same time as the rest of us, that these people had been released. But the government knew well before the decision was handed down that the court case existed. Court cases don't happen overnight. I've been a court reporter. They take months, sometimes years, to make it to court. Now, while the government might have had some confidence in the fact that the High Court upheld the validity of indefinite detention some 20 years ago, they should have known this was a risk. They should have drafted a bill ready to go if these people were released, as indeed they were. But they didn't have that ready. The Senate was sitting last week. The government could have introduced a bill there and then and sent it down to the lower house on Monday to be signed off. Or if they didn't have it ready to go last week, they could have lobbed it in the lower house on Monday morning. But that didn't happen either. They weren't ready. Presumably they'd been sitting on their hands. And then what we did get today was weak as water. The government wanted the ability to impose ankle bracelets on these people if it wanted to do so. It wanted the ability to impose curfews on them if it wanted to. It was basically just window dressing, no compulsion whatsoever. But by the time question time came around, the government had given in to the opposition and agreed to make ankle bracelets and curfews compulsory and ban them from working with children and vulnerable people.
The first is in relation to making curfews and electronic monitoring conditions mandatory, not discretionary. The second is requiring visa holders not to perform work or participate in any regular organised activity that involves contact with children. The third is requiring visa holders not to go within 150 metres of a school, childcare centre or daycare centre. The fourth is ensuring that each day of a breach of a visa condition be treated as a separate offence. The fifth is that if there is a visa holder who has been convicted of an offence involving violence or sexual assault, allowing the minister to put in place a no contact condition in respect of that individual. And the sixth is to establish mandatory minimum sentences in respect of those that breach this bill. What we have seen in the last few hours in the way in which we have cooperated across the aisle demonstrates that, notwithstanding differences and debate, Australia can look to their political leaders and their legislators as people who will act in their interest and work together to keep the community safe.
Now, it was clearly the right move, but earlier in the day, the government was not entertaining the opposition's amendments at all. But Mr Miles clearly woke up and realised what they'd offered wasn't enough. Meanwhile, Greens Senator Nick McKim went on a deranged rant today about this being Albanese's Tampa moment.
This is Anthony Albanese's Tampa moment. Labor's anti-refugee laws are going to be rushed through because Peter Dutton is insisting on it.
I mean, seriously. And he went on to say that it was double jeopardy and double punishment. All good, Nick. If you don't think there's a danger, then why don't you let them all stay at your house? Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson said the bill didn't go far enough.
It's not a big bill. It's 18 pages long. Frankly, it's pretty thin. And all it does is the absolute bare minimum required before the Parliament leaves. Our preliminary view is it doesn't go anywhere near far enough because none of the now 84 people who've been released, which, let's remember, include murderers, rapists and child sex offenders, will be redetained or otherwise protected from the community as a result of this bill.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton also noted how deficient it was.
The fact is that this bill should have been drafted months ago. It's inadequate in its current form.
Now, the government has clearly been caught on the hop and they're trying to mop up the mess, but doing a decidedly ordinary job of it. About the only valuable bit of the original bill was that if the former detainees break the conditions put upon them, they can be jailed for up to 5 years. Bravo. But just as the other day, when she was questioned about all this, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill couldn't deal with the issue directly without taking a swipe at the former government.
The Leader of the Opposition loves to present himself as a tough guy on the borders. He never wrote laws as tough as this, Speaker. He never wrote laws as tough as this.
Newsflash, Miss O'Neill, when Peter Dutton was Home Affairs Minister, these people didn't need to be jailed for breaking their conditions because they were already indefinitely detained. They were already locked up. And that was consistent with the understanding of the law at the time. You can't deflect your own incompetence by blaming the former government for not doing things it never needed to do because they were cancelling people's visas and trying to deport them. Which brings me to the next point. Why has no effort been made to re-detain any of these people in any way, shape or form? This was Miss O'Neill again today.
I've said it before and I will say it again. If I had any legal power to keep these people detained, I would. I would do it.
So they were let out, but what can you do to lock some of them back up again? I mean, it is absurd to think that you can come here as an asylum seeker and commit horrific crimes or commit horrific crimes elsewhere and then try to come here but be denied asylum. Yet we still have to keep you because the country you came from refuses to take you back we won't send you there because we think you'd be in danger. I mean, we may as well put up a big sign on the coastline advertising ourselves as the dumping ground for the rest of the world's criminal garbage. The anonymous child rapist who set all this off won his case on a constitutional argument that indefinite immigration detention breached the separation of powers between executive government and the judiciary. In other words, courts have to administer detention. They have to jail people, not the government itself. But courts, of course, administer the laws passed by the Parliament. So why can't the government introduce laws that would allow the courts to detain criminal asylum seekers that we cannot deport? If Ms O'Neill and Immigration Minister Andrew Giles were serious about keeping these people in jail, as Ms O'Neill says she is, then why wasn't that the bill on the table today? Why didn't she come with a proposal that would allow the courts to lock these people up because they are a risk to the public? Are you serious about this or not? These people should not be on the streets. Just because we don't want to send them back to where they came from because they might face the death penalty, and we disagree with that, or they're stateless, or their homeland won't take them back, or whatever else it is, it doesn't mean ordinary innocent Australians should have to live among them. If you break the law while you are seeking asylum, that should be it. No more chances. We shouldn't be a dumping ground for human rubbish. We deserve much better than that. Well, let's bring in Jenna Clark, Associate Editor of The Australian now, to discuss the news of the day. My God, it was a hell of a day in Parliament. Your response?
Yeah, Caleb, look, following on from your really strong editorial there, I think what we saw in question time, especially today and all throughout the House of Reps there, was complete and utter political and policy capitulation by the government to the coalition. And I think it's only made all the more toxic with the fact that we're now seeing, images beamed in from the Prime Minister touching down on another overseas trip to talk about things like AI. So I think it's going to be a very interesting weekend to see what the weekend papers have to say, specifically in my own newspaper by my colleagues Paul Kelly and Dennis Shanahan. But I think this could be very, very sticky for the government moving forward. And some great reporting by the West Australian on this story earlier this week.
Indeed, and we'll talk to a reporter from the West Australian about what he's been seeing later in the show. And it's just extraordinary how fast the government changed its tune today when it came to those amendments from the government. But I have to say, Richard Marles looked every bit the Prime Minister, even though he's acting in the role, when he stood up in question time and said this is the right thing to do. Might have been a bit late, but he showed some leadership.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, I think Mr Miles always conducts himself incredibly well, whether it be in media conferences or even on the floor. He's very measured, he's very calm, he has a really wry sense of humour, and there's never any, niggle across the chamber. So, look, I think he really showed himself up, and the fact that, Jim Chalmers may have some competition when it comes to potentially the next leader.
Yes, indeed. Now, an ABC radio presenter quit live on air yesterday. He said he was sick of receiving penalties for speaking bluntly. Josh Zepps made the shock announcement on ABC Radio Sydney afternoons. Take a listen.
Having truly rational, bullshit-free conversations about controversial issues is risky these days. The penalties for speaking bluntly, the penalties for trying to coax people out of their thought silos and their echo chambers are very high. You know that I don't do bullshit. I'm a bit of a straight shooter. The bottom line is I'm a bit too spicy for this gig.
It's an extraordinary admission, not just about himself. And I have to say, Josh Zepps would be among the best broadcasters the ABC has, because he does open up discussions from all angles, and he's very much committed to that. But apparently the ABC's not all on board with that.
Yeah, look, full credit to the bloke for, it's a pretty plum role. If you hand over a radio gig, especially on a metro station, it's a pretty plum gig. And to hand it over, full credit to him. They did it live on air, threw in a couple of spicy words, as he said. And I find it really interesting when you kind of delve a bit deeper into Josh. He did present afternoons in Sydney. He always had really fascinating takes. And I think what I really enjoyed about him as a broadcaster, and what I will continue to enjoy when he moves into his podcast world, is the fact that you never really know where he's going to land on a subject. And I find that really like a palate cleanser for opinion in this country. So I think it's great that the fact that, he's put it out there and said, I don't want any more bull dust, and it's going to be interesting to see what he does next and see how the ABC responds and who they put in the chair to replace him.
Yeah, well, we know what the ABC's ratings are looking like, particularly in radio at the moment. Who would have thought that if you move away from diversity of thought, that it doesn't translate to listeners? You can't just chase one market as they seem to do, particularly when that market is turning off. Now, concerning news today, a new report from the Royal Australian College of GPs has found that almost a third of all general practitioners in Australia intend to retire, quote unquote, in the next 5 years. So you've got not enough medical students interested in becoming GPs. They're going off to specialties instead because there's more money to be made there. Bulk billing is in decline. Medicare is in trouble. And then you've got all these other doctors saying that their workloads are intensifying. They're dealing with burnout. It's difficult to see patients. And then you add on top of that, at the moment, the state governments are all trying to levy payroll tax on GP clinics. Why would you want to be a doctor?
Exactly. This is a really alarming report, and considering that what we're hearing is, I think when we speak about burnout now in the sense of, workplaces, I think when it comes from the medical profession, we should really stand up and pay attention. And the fact that the healthcare systems around the country, no state government or territory government is covering themselves in glory when it comes to health at this point in time. So I think it's really alarming the fact that these GPs now are saying, 38% of our appointments now are concerned about mental health. And that isn't just a standard consult. That's not just, here's, some antibiotics for a cough. That's a really in-depth discussion you need to have. So I think the issue is, for so long, when you speak to a number of people in the medical profession, GP has sort of been seen as the arts degree of that sort of realm. So I think, especially when it comes to regional Australia, general practitioners are, worth their weight in gold to country towns. So I think the government definitely has to act on this. Maybe not at a federal level, but definitely at a state level. Yeah, well, they have to pull their finger out, because if people can't go to a GP, where are they going to go? They're going to go to the hospitals, and we know the hospitals are already at breaking point. Yeah, exactly. Or they'll be parked up in the back of an ambulance for 5 hours around the country. Indeed. Now, parents at an $11,000 a year Catholic school in New South Wales are getting all hot and bothered over plans to make students study at home 1 day a week. So they want to apply this to the year 10 to 12 students at Chevalier College. They're going to be invited to learn from home on some Mondays to reduce face-to-face teaching and encourage professional learning and set students up for success in the modern world, apparently. Sounds a bit more like an excuse to get the kids out of the classroom so the teachers don't have to deal with them, and the poor old parents who are trying to hold down jobs in a cost of living crisis have to deal with them instead. What would baby Jesus think? That's all I read when I thought when I read this article today. And I think what is so alarming is that they're so tone deaf with the fact that, aren't you noticing the absolute decline in the education standards in this country at this point in time? We are getting dumber. We need more kids in school for probably a little bit longer. And even more alarming, I think, when you look at, what we're seeing now with the fact of, what's happening in Gaza and the way that students are sort of reacting to those situations, we need to be focusing on, what anti-Semitism is, focusing on world history and again, as we saw during the Voice referendum, also our very own Australian and Indigenous history. So more time in classrooms, maybe. Yes, indeed. Now, quickly before we go, Jenna, the alcoholic drink Hard Solo, they've got to change their name now to Hard Rated after the alcoholic beverages advertising code found the boozy version of the popular soft drink apparently breaches the industry code by appealing to minors. I mean, come on. We are living in a nanny state, aren't we? Yeah, look, and I think that maybe some of the people that were in charge of marketing of Hard Solo had probably sunk about a six-pack of those before they came up with hard... What is it? What's the new phrase?
Hard rated.
I'm definitely going to... I'm not going to order a hard rated when I go to the pub, that's
Doesn't
for sure.
sound as good as Hard Solo, does it?
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think we've got better things and more important things to worry about. The fact that kids may potentially want to drink want to drink an alcoholic soda, because I don't really think they will, because it won't even
they
won't be available to them.
They can't walk into a bottle shop and buy one anyway. But look, I've gone and got my collector's edition version today. It'll be worth a lot of money in the future, I hope. Jenna Clark, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Well, coming up, Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie on the gruesome 43-minute video he was shown, detailing exactly what happened in Israel on the 7th of October. Plus, I'll speak to one journalist who spent the night at a WA motel housing these released asylum seeker detainees. That's after this. Welcome back, Caleb Bond in for Sharri. Well, last night, members of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security were shown a gruesome 43-minute video by the Israeli ambassador captured during Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October. It captured the reality of what actually happened on that dark day. Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie watched the video himself, and he joins me now. Andrew, thank you for joining me, and a warning to viewers, some of what they might be about to hear may be distressing and graphic, but what did you see in this video?
Good evening, Caleb. Well, the Israeli ambassador offered to show the video to members of the Parliamentary Committee for Intelligence and Security, and we thought it was a special obligation on us to watch it. It is important that we understand the true character of a listed terror organisation like Hamas, and so all coalition members attended. And I've got to say, it was horrific, it was brutal. It was 43 minutes. On it, there were 138 murders, which is less than 10% of the Israelis who were murdered that day by Hamas. And can I say, having seen it, evil truly did walk the earth on October 7th in southern Israel.
I mean, obviously, the layperson is not privy to that video, and probably nor should they be. But having watched that, when you hear people like Francesca Albanese, for instance, who last night was on the project, more or less suggesting, and she's the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, human rights, etc., she was basically suggesting last night that Israel should not have retaliated after the events of October 7th. For anyone who has watched that video as you have, I'm sure you'd have a very different view.
She's absolutely clueless. In fact, she's outright wrong. And what she's saying is just, I think, appalling. Because frankly, we saw female IDF soldiers cowering under a table, gunned down by Hamas in cold blood. We saw two young boys with their father have a grenade thrown at them. The father was then gunned down in cold blood in front of them, in his underwear. One of the little boys lost an eye. You can see the impact. It was tough. The point I raise, the point I want your viewers to understand is that Hamas, they started this, and those who call for a ceasefire don't understand how ruthless and how brutal these people are. And so for Israel, they have to act. They can't be weak. Hamas can end this right now by surrendering and handing over the hostages, or the only alternative is for Israel to destroy politically and militarily Hamas. And that's the decision that they're facing. And so they're pressing on. And I've got to say, it's Hamas who are using hospitals and civilians as human shields. The blood that has been spilled is on Hamas. But there's a reason we watched it, and that is so that we can communicate directly with the Australian people the true character of Hamas on October 7th, so that we can repudiate the comments made by Ms Albanese at the National Press Club as just foolish and outright wrong.
And I mean, you are a military man. You know the realities of war, and you, having watched that video, are emotional about it. And that speaks to the humanity of what has happened. And that is what is missing from a lot of this discussion. I mean, people talk in abstract terms, as Penny Wong did last Sunday on Insiders, and Ali did this week on this network, about, you know, the idea of a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause, as they wrap it up in their poly speak. But the reality of that, as you note, is that you can only have a ceasefire if both parties come to the table. Now, when you're dealing with a terrorist organisation like Hamas, that is not going to happen. The only situation in which you reach a ceasefire, is either to wipe Hamas off the face of the planet or to scare them into submission. There's no other way.
That's right. Every tyrant who's ever walked the earth preys on weakness. And so this is a time to be strong. This is a time to stand up to evil. And as I said, Hamas can surrender and hand back the hostages, or they have to be destroyed both militarily and politically. And that's the path they have chosen. War is incredibly messy, and I've seen it firsthand myself, and decisions are very, very difficult and mistakes are made. There is a cost to war, there's no question, but this war was started by Hamas. And again, they have agency here. They can surrender and hand back the hostages.
Now, before we move on, Andrew, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with his US counterpart today in his first trip to America in 6 years, and both leaders have pledged to reduce tensions at the APEC forum. Xi said that turning our back on each other is not an option, but he's also warned Biden that that Taiwan's reunification into China is quote-unquote unstoppable, and that the US should stop arming Taiwan and support China's, in his words, peaceful reunification. And bizarrely, Biden appeared to agree. Take a look.
Look, I reiterate what I've said since I've become president, what every previous president of late has said, that we maintain the agreement that there is a one China policy, and that I'm not going to change that. That's not going to change. And so that's about the extent to which we discussed it.
Why would he do that?
Well, that's a good question for President Biden, Caleb. But can I say it's a good thing that President Xi and President Biden are meeting. It's unremarkable that there is geopolitical competition between the United States and China. Of course, Australia is a very close partner of the United States. We also have trade ties with China. So this is a very difficult situation for us to navigate. But I do want to remind your viewers that Australia has taken a position through AUKUS. We have taken a position through the investment that we're about to receive from Microsoft, $5 billion worth into the Australian Public Service for artificial intelligence, which the Prime Minister announced in San Francisco today. So we know who our friends are. At the same time, we need to maintain good relations with all our neighbours, and that's the challenge for this government, without giving away our sovereignty and without being weak into the bargain.
Andrew Hastie, thank you so much for your insight tonight. I really appreciate it. Well, my next guest spent a night at the Thornley Motel with the dozens of criminals just released from Yongah Hill Detention Centre. Despite the government promising they were keeping a close eye on these detainees, Caleb Runciman exposed just how much freedom these criminals have been granted in an exclusive investigation for the West Australian. Caleb Runciman joins us now to tell more. Caleb, it's good to have a Caleb on the show. I don't think I've ever actually spoken to another Caleb on this program. So welcome aboard, but tell us a bit about what you saw last night. I understand that there's not a lot of control going on.
No, Caleb, there's always a first for everything. Pleasure to be with you today. So I spent a night, an afternoon and a morning at this Thornley Motel earlier this week. It was shocking, it was confronting. There was about a dozen detainees there, and they were rushed from Yongah Hill on Saturday afternoon. Now, these guys were up late talking about smoking weed. They were getting picked up from people in cars and were driving around the city. Now, this obviously comes as the government said they were keeping, a close watch on these people. It really didn't seem like that was the case.
Well, it sounds like they're having a whale of a time, as well they would want to be after spending so much time in detention, I suppose. But, we're talking here about people who are potentially criminals. We know rapists have been released, murderers have been released. The fact that they're not having anyone keeping an eye on them, how are we meant to have any confidence that these people are under control, or even that the legislation that was introduced in Parliament today will touch the sides?
I mean, it really was only until today that we saw the government acting on this. It came as, we had state and federal politicians saying that they were doing everything they could to keep the community safe. But it wasn't until today that they actually, put their foot down and showed some backbone, I think.
Can I ask, did you feel unsafe at any point?
Probably most definitely. The door wasn't deadlocked, for starters, in my motel room. When I arrived, first and foremost, there was no receptionist, there was no police, there was no Border Force representative that were supposed to be, keeping watch on these guys. So it ended up being that a guest at the hotel ended up lifting a pot plant up and handing me the keys to my room. I didn't even have to provide any form of identification. Yeah, I'm not joking. I was provided the keys and I walked straight into the room without providing any form of identification.
So you basically just checked yourself in?
Yep, pretty much.
It's extraordinary. I mean, I laugh because if I didn't laugh, I'd cry.
Yeah. To add to that as well, there was a gate to the motel that was unlocked 24/7. I couldn't actually find the entry initially, and so I ended up pulling it open myself and driving the car through. That was the state of this motel.
And this is where we're keeping these people. I can't get over it. And you've already got people in the community, victims of people who've been released, are feeling the effects of this. A report in your paper today, domestic violence victim in WA, who's had to go to the police to seek further security after finding out that her abuser is now out in the community free. And there another report of a rape victim who was told that her abuser would never see the light of day. She's had a call from police to say that he's now been released into the Brisbane community. And from everything we can assume, from what you've seen of how these people are being quote unquote monitored, you wouldn't be shocked to hear that one of these people has gone and reoffended, would you?
No, I mean, it's hard to say, really, until that time comes. If it does come, it would be shocking. So we really do hope that the government does, act on this and keep the community safe, really.
Well, Caleb, keep up your fine work because it has given us a window into this that we truly needed. Caleb Runciman, thank you so much for your time. Well, coming up, a class action lawsuit is looming over the High Court over the indefinite detention ruling, but will it ever actually materialise? Jason Morrison and Holly Hughes join me next after this. Welcome back. I'm Caleb Bond in for Sharri Marks, and tonight, well, if you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to be across tonight. New emergency laws for released detainees passed the House of Representatives, necessitating ankle bracelets and curfews for the newly freed criminals. Labor has axed 50 road and rail projects nationwide as spiralling costs and runaway delays blew out the Commonwealth's $120 billion budget by over a quarter. Australia's unemployment rate has risen from 3.6% to 3.7% in October, with 27,900 more people now out of work. Chinese President Xi Jinping has warned the US to stop arming Taiwan and, quote-unquote, support China's peaceful reunification efforts in his first trip to the country in 6 years. And Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie has exclusively revealed to us the gruesome 43-minute video he was shown by the Israeli government that brought him to tears, detailing exactly what Hamas did on the 7th of October.
We saw 2 young boys with their father have a grenade thrown at them. You can see the impact. It was tough. The point I raise, the point I want your viewers to understand is that Hamas, they started this.
Well, the Albanese government could be forced to pay out tens of millions of dollars in compensation after the High Court's controversial decision to outlaw indefinite detention. Solicitor General Stephen Donoghue is warning the scrapping of the policy that saw dozens of criminals detained indefinitely would open the door to undefendable damages claims, quote unquote. Let's bring in my panel now, commentator Jason Morrison and Liberal Senator for New South Wales, Holly Hughes. Holly, I would have thought, I'm not a lawyer, but I would have thought that given the government at the time was operating under an interpretation of the law that was given, granted by the High Court some 20 years ago, and that there'd been no challenge to it to this point, that they were operating within the law and they would have a defendable case and that these people shouldn't be paid out.
Yeah, look, I'm not a lawyer either, so I'm not going to weigh in on the legalities of that. But what I think is the most extraordinary thing about this whole saga is the government has literally been caught asleep at the wheel. Whilst this High Court challenge was going on, at the very least, this government should have been preparing for this finding so that they were ready, should this happen, to make, have legislation ready to go so that it could be combated very, very quickly. And what we've seen over the last week is just an absolute schmozzle. We were told in the Senate last week by Minister Watt that no one was going to be released until they had the reasons for the High Court's decision. They're not due to be released until February. Well, then the next day, Minister Watt came in and said, well, actually, no, we're doing it now, and there's, so many that are being let out. We now know it's around 93, but that number could actually skyrocket. It could be considerably higher. And these people are now out in the community. No one really knows where they are, what they're doing. And these are people who've already been found guilty of some very heinous crimes. Yet, apparently, they have more rights than Australian citizens when it comes to freedom in the community.
Well, you would have heard, Jason, my interview with Caleb Runciman before from the West Australian, who spent the night at one of these motels where these people are being kept, quote unquote, and there is no control at all. It's just extraordinary. But the insulting cherry on top would be if these people then got compensation out of the government for the fact that they were locked up.
There's always a lawyer circling, isn't there?
Oh,
and the only reason we're in this predicament, actually there's two reasons. One, crap laws. Crap laws passed by unworldly people in Parliament and bad advisors telling them to pass crap laws. That's the only reason we're here. If this had been a reasonably debated and reasonably apportioned law, the High Court wouldn't have had a chance to blow a hole in the side of it. They did it very quickly. So there's your point one. Point two is the only reason a rapist was able to take that action is because there was the typical lawyer out there, the activist lawyer circling, the same one that's putting around today that there could be tens of millions. I'll give you the tip, there'll be no compensation. These people will be lucky if they are here in 6 months. But there'll be a tribunal somewhere that will find some ability to be able to extend them. But you ask where they are. I mean, you had the West Australian talking about it. Rob Avadia from Channel 7 News found them at a motel somewhere around near Bankstown the other day. And there's another group in Canberra. And why are they not being held and detained? Because they can't be detained because our Parliament passed crap laws and the High Court did its job. And this is the thing that's hard to stomach, but the High Court did its job here. Yeah. It actually said, I'm sorry, you can't double punish someone. Yeah. Now, if there's a room full of people, and Holly, that includes many of your colleagues, if they can't come to terms with the fact that that's our system, then I just wonder what games are going on in Parliament at the real job being to actually to legislate the right outcomes for the protection of Australians.
Correct. And I think what you saw out of the government
as Caleb
today
makes the point, though, these laws have been in place for 20 years. They're
doesn't
not,
matter.
This
doesn't
isn't
matter.
a change of law.
Doesn't
it's been
matter
in place
how long.
for 20 years. But I'm worried that the laws that are being put through tonight that have been devised by the Labor government in an awful rush, that we were only given 2 hours this morning in a briefing on them, that, they will not be up to the strength that they need to be. Certainly Peter Dutton and the team around him put forward some amendments. I'm here. The debate's just restarted in the Senate, so I'm not right on the pace because it just started at 5:30 again to where those amendments are up to. I understand there might be some agreement with all of our amendments, which would at least give a provision that if these people breach one of the visa conditions that are going to be put on them, that they actually then can be detained. They can be put into jail. But that was something that, was unenforceable until some of these amendments were put forward.
My point is, Holly, and not to harp on this, but, you're sitting up here talking to us tonight, which is good, and this debate, a crucial debate for the protection of Australians, is going on in the Parliament. And I just wonder how many of your colleagues and those on the other side of the room will actually be getting the advice and getting the legal advice, or just party voting down lines, which is how we've ended up with crap legislation in the first place. I mean, frankly, we pay parliamentarians. But you have a vote in this. You have a vote in this, and so did the opposition.
No, absolutely, we do.
And so did the government before. And it's really easy to say, the Albanese government didn't do a thing. I agree with you. They would have had holding positions ready to go on this for the public relations battle, but they weren't ready to go on this for the protection of Australians battle. This is crucial stuff, and we've got to make sure that the job is done by all sides on this, not just by one side.
Well, the Greens will vote against it. The Greens are more concerned with these people having freedom than the protection of Australian citizens. These people literally live in fairyland with unicorns. It's just
Nick McKim today described it as Albanese's Tampa moment, which is just extraordinary. And then would say, double jeopardy, mate. Let them live in your house.
Yeah, they're vaudeville actors.
They're just absolutely
just extraordinary. Now, Teal MP Allegra Spender has asked Parliament and Australians to lower the temperature, quote unquote, when it comes to discussing anti-Semitism. She called yesterday's explosive debate between the Labor and Liberal leaders a shouting match that projected division in Parliament. Take a listen.
What we all need to be doing right now is lowering the temperature and saying we are all Australians. Whatever your views of what's happening overseas, we're all Australians. We need to be dealing with each other with care, with compassion, and bringing the country together, not creating false divides.
Lower the temperature. Well, how about going to that protest they had in Sydney on Sunday with 50,000 people marching supposedly pro-Palestine, they're actually pro-Hamas, and telling them to lower the temperature and see how that goes down?
A lot of assumptions there in the MP's statement. We're all Australians. I challenge her on that front. I think, and I say it often, there are Australians and there are people who just live here.
Yes.
And there are people, and a lot of those goons you see out behaving in the way they do and calling for blood and calling for people to be gassed and to F the Jews, etc., etc. They're people who are just passengers in this society. They're actually not Australians. They pretend to be it because Australians don't behave like this. And so, again, we sort of go appealing to the better nature of better people. I think on many fronts we're trying to appeal to the better nation of people who have no interest at all in the harmony that they pretend to be a part of.
Yeah, indeed. And Holly, I mean, how could you seriously say, well, let's lower the temperature here? We're talking about anti-Semitism, which is at epidemic levels. I mean, we've not seen anti-Semitism like this for a very long time. I haven't seen numbers out of Australia in terms of, actually reported anti-Semitic events, but we've seen numbers out of France where it's gone through the roof, something like 100% increase, if not more, since October the 7th. And we're told by Allegra Spender to lower the temperature on the discussion about anti-Semitism. Seriously.
Look, and this is the lady who represents the electorate with one of the largest Jewish populations, but was deliberately, taunted by a motorcycle ride from, out in southwest Sydney that came straight through the eastern suburbs of Sydney of pro-Palestinian people. It was deliberately provocative. It was done to incite fear into those communities. Yet here she is sort of saying, everyone just settle down and all have big hug and kumbaya. The problem is, though, there's no leadership here from Anthony Albanese. And he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. He has many in his party who are very, not only pro-Palestine, but anti-Israel. And he is trying to walk a line that he cannot do at this time. He needs to be very strong that anti-Semitic behaviour will not be tolerated. You do not see it happening in the reverse. Yet when
Correct.
he talks about these things, he's talking as if everyone, everyone's been as bad as each other, all come back together. It's not that situation at all. And to pretend that that's what it is incredibly disingenuous. But,
Caleb,
Albanese, he's not even in the country. He's not even in the country.
And
We've got
the other problem, sorry, Holly, I was going to point out, one of the things I think that the Prime Minister suffers from is that he's very support based in his party.
Correct.
He's very support based.
Correct.
In fact, don't subscribe to these views.
And
look at the union movement. I mean, who are the big financiers of the pro-Palestine demonstrations at the moment, and who are pushing behind it?
Yeah,
the far left
unions for Palestine. How many unions are there in Palestine? That goes down really well, doesn't it? Holly Hughes, Jason Morrison, thank you so much for your time. Well, after the break, a daughter interviews her mother on her survival during the Holocaust and hears terrible tales of hate, but also extraordinary stories of love. Don't go away. Welcome back, Caleb Bond in for Sharri. Well, working through her grief, my next guest interviewed her terminally ill mother, Holocaust survivor Mira, as she lay dying of cancer. And what she uncovered were incredible stories of human goodness and love within all the horror and death of Nazi Germany. Journalist Rochelle Unreich turned these stories into a memoir called A Brilliant Life, and she joins me now. Rochelle, thank you so much for coming on the program. Tell me a bit about the stories your mother told you and why you thought it was so important to write this book.
I think the catalyst for this book was during the Holocaust, my mother had seen incredible horror. She'd been through 4 concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and on a death march. But what was extraordinary was that when she was interviewed by the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, who did the first testimony, she described this litany of horrors, one after the other. And at the end of it, the interviewer said to her, "Is there anything you want to add, anything you learnt?" And she responded, "In the Holocaust, I learned about the goodness of people." And to me, a thing I heard all my life, I just couldn't believe it. It was so incredulous. How could she have seen the worst of man's cruelty and instead focused on the incredible goodness of humanity?
I mean, it's an extraordinary point of view to take, I suppose, but these things are personal to all of us, and that message of hope through the darkness that she saw would seem to me to be more important now than ever before, particularly when we look at the events overseas in Israel.
Absolutely, and I think that her message was so strong that you really have to believe that there is goodness and that there is a possibility of tomorrow being better than today. One of the things that really struck me was after her death, I looked through some old birthday cards that she wrote me. She was a very effusive writer of birthday cards. And in one, I was going through a tough time, and she wrote in capital letters in the middle of nothing, "The happiness is near." And I thought, what does that mean? Is that a prediction? But writing the book, I came to realise that what she meant is even if you can't see it, even if the darkness is surrounding you, the happiness is always near. You might not see it, but you have to believe in it. You might not see the light, but if you can't, you have to be the light yourself with your own essence.
We've only got 30 seconds, Rochelle, but how do you think she found that strength and that light? Because it is truly extraordinary.
She really did have people who helped her all throughout the Holocaust, both before she was deported to camps and during. People who intervened to save her life, people who hid her, women in camp who did jobs instead of her. And so she had evidence of it. And she was resilient, she was proud, she was strong, she had hope and she had faith.
Rochelle Unreich, thank you so much for joining me to tell that story. And A Brilliant Life is the memoir. You can find it in all good bookstores. Well, that's all we've got time for today. I'll be back later in the evening, 10 p.m, for the late debate. Stick around for that. And I'll be on Chris Kenny tonight in the meantime. So you get 3 doses of Caleb Bond tonight if you don't turn the telly off in the meantime because you've had enough. Stay tuned. Peter Credlin's up next.